So, famous atheist Alex O'Connor recently said something that nobody, especially not his teenage new atheist self, ever expected to come out of his mouth, that Christianity is more plausible than he once thought. And judging by the internet's reaction, you'd think that he announced a date for his baptism. Christians freaked out, atheists freaked out, and Alex had to make a whole follow-up video just to say, guys, calm down. But here's the thing, Alex is right. Christianity is way more plausible than he realized. And not because of philosophy, although I do love philosophy, not because of hidden Bible codes, and not because of Pascal's Wager 2.0. It's because of hard, physical, scientifically documented evidence for Christianity he hasn't yet seen. A few weeks ago, Alex O'Connor sat down with Bear Grylls. I would love a chance to actually sit down with him myself. And in the middle of their conversation, Bear asks him a very simple question. Where has your journey led you? And Alex gives an answer that sent Christian YouTube into orbit. Here's the clip.
But you've had such a journey and you've met so many amazing people and you've debated so many different angles and things. Yeah. Where's it led you to?
It's led me to, well, I used to be quite on board with the new atheism stuff. I've spoken about this a lot on my show.
What does that mean?
You know, like the sort of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, it was really popular, the debates that they were doing, they called it new atheism.
Yeah.
And it was this body of like atheist thought with the God delusion, this kind of stuff, which was really popular. And it had this sort of quite strident, debate me bro kind of attitude. And I was really swept up by that. I thought that was really exciting and cool. And I was beginning to sort of shake that off and grow up a bit, essentially. And then running the podcast, what I've realized is that this is far more interesting and intricate. And I would say plausible than I'd given it credit for before. So, I'm still not a Christian.
So, Alex says that Christianity is more plausible than he gave it credit for back in his new atheist days. Now, naturally, Christians took this and ran with it. My feed turned into a parade of videos titled, Alex is this close to conversion. Pray for Alex. And is Cosmic Skeptic becoming Cosmic Christian? You get the idea. But then Alex responded, and in classic Alex fashion, he clarified exactly what he actually meant. He's not joining RCIA tomorrow. He's just acknowledging that teenage Alex was operating with a pretty shallow, overly combative view of religion. Let's watch what he actually said.
So here's what really happened. If you've watched my channel for any amount of time, you'll know that I'm quite a staunch critic of Christianity and religion and theism in general. And when I was like 17 or 18 and I started making videos, I was a lot more forthright with that atheism. I thought that atheism wasn't just true, but beneficial for society. I thought that religion was harmful. I was really in line with the new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who influenced me greatly into a position that religion is just this utterly irrational and evil force in the world. In the past decade, I've come to see this as something of a shallow view. I think it depends on the religious tradition, because they're quite different. I think it depends on the time in history. I think it depends on the cultural context. And yeah, of course, any historian or sociologist will tell you that it's never as straightforward as I think the new atheists made it out to be. But also on the point of God's existence, I also think that the new atheists didn't really give enough credence to some of the arguments for the existence of God. Richard Dawkins, for example, in The God Delusion, spends 2 pages on Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways. 2 pages. And I think in a way that doesn't properly deal with the significance of the arguments that Aquinas was putting forward. Now look, I still don't believe in God. Okay? I just don't think that it's true. But what I will say is that when I was 17 or 18 and I was swept up with this kind of material, I thought that all of the arguments for God's existence were complete nonsense, and that all the arguments against God's existence were an epitome of perfect rationality. I've now come to prefer the term agnostic over atheist. I mean, it's a problem in itself, even trying to define what God is and what God would look like, but I think there are good reasons to believe in God. I also think there are very good reasons to not believe in God. And some of you might be thinking, what, like good reasons to believe in God? What are you talking about? I don't mean like conclusive reasons. I don't mean that I have like an argument which should compel a rational person to say that God exists. I just mean that there are like compelling considerations. And look, I don't really want to go into them now, and I don't have time exactly, but that's not even the point, because all this video is a clip from a podcast in which, by the way, Bear Grylls just like asks me, where has this led you? And I say, since the beginning of my career? I mean, I think it's more plausible than I did when I was a teenager. That's it. That's not like an extraordinary thing to say.
And toward the end of that same video, he spells it out even more clearly.
And certainly the next time you see me talking positively about Christianity and saying that it might be more plausible than the new atheists give it credit for, please do not read this as me being on the verge of a conversion, and certainly don't read it as me partaking in some kind of grift.
So that's the context. Alex isn't hinting at an imminent conversion. He's not grifting. He's not signaling some dramatic theological plot twist. He's simply saying, I now take Christianity more seriously than I used to. Perfect. That's actually the best starting point for this video, because if Alex thinks Christianity is more plausible, I want to show him just how plausible it really is. So here's what I want to do in this video. Alex says he's not on the verge of converting, but what I want to do is give him reasons to full on convert. Not with philosophy, although again, I love philosophy, not with fine-tuning or cosmological arguments, not even with the case for the resurrection from the New Testament. I want to show him modern, scientifically documented miracles so strong they leave naturalism with nowhere to hide. And before we dive in, I've chapter marked this entire video so you can jump directly to whatever miracle grabs your curiosity the most. For example, if you want to, you can jump ahead to the miracle where a woman's face was literally being eaten away and half missing and then grew back in a matter of minutes. Every one of these cases is absolutely wild and completely unexpected on atheism. Now, obviously, Christianity has miracle claims all over the map. We could go to Zaytun, Egypt, where hundreds of thousands of people, Muslims included, saw the Virgin Mary with their own eyes for years. Or we could look at the highly evidenced Eucharistic miracles like Tixla or Lanciano, which I've covered elsewhere. But for this video, I've chosen Lourdes. Why Lourdes? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are two big reasons. First, these miracles sit right inside the Catholic tradition, by far the largest branch of Christianity. So the theological implications aren't vague or generic. They point directly to Christianity. And then second, the miracles at Lourdes are some of the most rigorously medically investigated events on the planet. Every case has medical records. Every case was reviewed by doctors, and every case defies natural explanation. Over the next several minutes, we're going to walk through 3 of the strongest cases from Lourdes across 3 different centuries. And trust me, you haven't seen or heard anything like this. If you want to understand why Christianity is far more plausible than Alex, or a lot of people think, this is the evidence everyone's missing. To really appreciate what's happening in these healings and why I say that they confirm Christianity specifically, we need to rewind to a very specific place in time, Lourdes, 1858. Picture a poor, unknown 14-year-old peasant girl, Bernadette Saburius, walking near a rocky grotto named Mazabiel on the edge of town. She starts reporting a series of encounters, 18 apparitions in total, with a lady dressed in white, wearing a blue sash and holding a rosary. The lady keeps asking her to pray for sinners, to do penance, and have a chapel built here and bring people here in procession. Bernadette has no theological education, no social power, nothing that would make her an obvious candidate for world-changing visions. During one of these apparitions, the lady tells Bernadette to dig and drink from a tiny hidden trickle of water in the grotto. That trickle becomes a spring, and almost immediately people start talking about healings connected to this water. But then comes the bombshell. On March 25th, 1858, the lady finally reveals her identity with the words, quote, "I am the Immaculate Conception." Now, that title had just been formally defined as Catholic dogma just 4 years earlier, something a 14-year-old poorly catechized peasant girl is extremely, extremely unlikely to have invented or even fully understood on her own. Local officials are skeptical, even hostile, and therefore access to the grotto is restricted. Contemporary observers also started noticing strange things around Bernadette herself. In one famous incident, the town physician, Dr. Dazos, watched as the flame of her prayer candle licked along her hand for several minutes while she was in ecstasy without leaving any burns. When the apparition ended, he immediately tested her again with another candle, and this time she yanked her hand away, protesting that he was burning her. Now, whatever you think is going on here, it's at least hard to square with the idea that this is just some bored village girl putting on a show. After a full canonical investigation in 1862, 4 years later, the Bishop of Tarbes officially declares that the Virgin Mary really did appear to Bernadette, and a chapel is built exactly where the lady requested. From there, things snowball. The spring gets surrounded by a growing sanctuary complex, grotto, chapels, basilicas, and eventually the famous baths. As more pilgrims come, more healings are reported. The stories range from, I feel a little bit better, to my terminal disease vanished and my scans completely changed. To separate emotion from evidence, a Lourdes Medical Bureau is established, a standing team of doctors, including non-believers, whose entire job is to rigorously examine alleged cures. Over time, more than 7,000 cases are submitted, and only a tiny fraction, just over 70, are judged medically inexplicable after decades of follow-up and cross-examination. These aren't private backroom claims. They're documented, published, and open to outside scrutiny. Those three threads together, the Church's formal recognition of the apparitions, the spring tied to reported healings, and the creation of a literal medical apparatus that aggressively filters out hype, turned Lourdes from a forgotten backwater into one of the major Christian pilgrimage sites on earth, drawing 4 to 6 million visitors seeking physical and spiritual healing every year. Out of those thousands of cases, we're going to zoom in on a very small set, just 3, that are frankly brutal to naturalism. To help us walk through these cases, I brought on someone who has spent years researching the medical documentation behind the Lourdes miracles, Caleb Jackson. Caleb has been digging through hospital records, peer-reviewed analyses, historical testimonies, and the internal reports from the Lourdes Medical Bureau itself, basically doing the kind of deep dive work most people never even realize exists. Before we recorded, Caleb and I talked a bit about his upcoming book on miracles and the insane amount of editing and vetting it's already been through. He's been compiling timelines, medical histories, diagnostic criteria, the whole 9 yards to make sure that these cases are represented with total accuracy. And as you'll see in this interview, he knows these cases backward and forward. He's not just summarizing stories, he's walking us through the clinical details, the diagnostic evidence, the eyewitness testimony, and the layers of medical review that make these particular miracles really stand out. So with that, let's jump into our conversation. I start by asking Caleb to lay out our first case we're covering today. Oh, and if you are the skeptical type, toward the end of the interview, we address common skeptical objections to Lourdes miracles. So stay tuned for that. And by the way, I want you guys to investigate everything that we say in this following section. Really do some research. I think what you're going to find is going to blow you away. So Caleb, tell us about our first case.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. So I think it's great to focus on multiple cases from different time frames and different centuries in Lourdes to encompass the variety of cures that we have here. So the first case that I would want to point the audience to is that of Marie Le Marchand, which is the French pronunciation, or if you want to be American or English, Marie Le Marchand. So Marie was struck with an illness that was very common back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, which was pulmonary tuberculosis, which, as you know, is bacteria that causes the lungs to get congested and bleed. And at that time period was almost unanimously fatal. They didn't cure it till they discovered penicillin several decades later in the 1920s and 1940s. So Marie was struck with this in the summer of 1892. And so she felt fatigued. She grew more pale. She was coughing up blood visibly. And there were no treatments around that time that could really cure her. So her doctor considered her to be a pretty hopeless case. And over the next 3 months, from June to about August, her condition deteriorated and she was no longer really even able to walk. She was just so fatigued, didn't weigh much. And by August, the tuberculosis has spread, as it often did back in that day, to other parts of the body and caused ulceration. So there were parts that were eating away at her face, big wounds on her nose that was eating away at the cartilage, to the point where she couldn't close her mouth all the way. You could see her teeth, and very grotesque sight in that way. And what's interesting is that a famous author named Émile Zola, who was a staunch rationalist and a big critic of Lourdes, actually was there at the time when Marie was visiting Lourdes. And then Marie had gotten her doctor to sign off on a certificate where he didn't think it was a good idea for her to go to Lourdes, but he designated in, I believe it was July of 1892, that, Marie Le Marchand has the diagnosis of tuberculosis, is coughing up blood, has fragility, cannot walk, etc., etc. So Émile Zola is on the train with Marie, and he describes her condition as quite horrid in his book, on Lourdes. So in his novel, Émile Zola gives Marie the designation of the name Lys Roquet, which is the pseudonym he uses. But he says, among other things, quote, "A hoarse voice growled confused words under the black veil, and at last the veil fell and the witnesses shuddered in horror. It was a case of lupus which had preyed upon the unhappy woman's nose and mouth." Lupus, by the way, is a skin disease that can sometimes be associated with tuberculosis in the sense, lupus vulgaris. He goes on to write, "Ulceration had increased and was hourly increasing. In short, all the hideous peculiarities of this disease were in full process of development, almost obliterating the traces of what was once pleasantly woman lineaments." So Zola does not paint a very pretty picture here of what it is. And so at the time that Marie Le Marchand gets to Lourdes, she's in a hopeless state. Her face is wrapped up in bandages and a veil. And for the few people who do see her actual face, they are horrified and quite frankly disgusted. So Marie goes there and is on a stretcher and prays to the Virgin Mary that she will have mercy on her and will be healed. And so as she comes out of the water, she regains use in her legs for the first time in many months, despite having significant muscle atrophy and weakness and fatigue. And as she takes the linens off, multiple witnesses, including some doctors of Lourdes who were there with other pilgrims, note that the ulceration in her face, these huge wounds that were eating away the cartilage on her face and the skin, were now healed over. They were now scarred over, and there was like bright red lines. And her skin was now a light pink, as if you just, whenever you get a cut and it heals and it's like fresh new skin, it was like that. So the skin was still discolored, but now covered in a very faint light red scar and pink skin. And this was obviously astounding. And the same day that this happened, the head Lourdes doctor, Gustave Boissary, president of the Lourdes Medical Bureau, comes and is showing this off. And he shows this off to Émile Zola and says, "Behold, Zola, this is the case of your dreams," right? And this was phenomenal. So Zola would go on to write about this in his book, which was published 2 years after this happened in 1894. And Zola does not deny that this happened. He says that, yes, there was a woman named Lys Roquet, and she had this horrible disfigurement in her face caused by lupus and tuberculosis, and it healed. But Zola tries to write it off as psychosomatic. Back in that day, it was common to say women were hysterical and they could write off any disease by female hysteria, that emotions could basically cause you to break out and cause ulceration, which today obviously sounds ridiculous, but back then it was commonly believed. So Zola says that she was hysterical, that this was psychosomatic, and that this gradually went away, that she applied water, and that over the course of many days, the wounds slightly went away rather than instantaneously. And when he published this got backfire and backlash from many of the witnesses who were there. In fact, Boissary set up a medical conference the same year that came out where he called Zola out. And he presented Marie in front of medical students and was reading off Zola's description and was reading off the witness affidavits from doctors, including her own doctor, where they all confirmed that, yes, this happened instantaneously, that they had seen the wounds closing within just a few minutes. And one of those medical students actually wrote to her doctor, primary physician, Dr. Lenil. And Dr. Lenil confirmed that, yes, the reports were accurate, that this had healed instantaneously, that she had come back that same month, a few days after she got back from Lourdes, and he verified that she had been completely healed, that the tuberculosis in her lungs was now gone, that the facial scars and facial wounds were now gone. She did still have the scars and actual marks for a few years after that, but the actual open sores had healed over in a few minutes with new skin until they eventually faded away. And so now there are photographs of Marie Le Marchand many years after the fact, where she was healed. And newspapers at this time also would interview her and called Zola out for misrepresenting this. And Zola's essential response was, well, I'm a literary author. I'm able to take authorial renditions and able to change things to fit the story. And so he basically conceded that he was altering the details of the story. And other people who had been there for other cures that Zola talks about complained that he misrepresented their cures. There was a different cure where Zola had essentially said that the person had relapsed and died. And the person actually wrote to the newspaper saying, literally, I'm still alive. I'm right here. My family's here. And Zola's wrong to say that I died in his book. So Zola got quite a lot of backlash for misrepresenting many cases in that sense. And even Zola's own supporters, including a French scientist like himself, a rationalist, would critique him in later texts and works and basically say, like, look, this was an instantaneous healing, and Zola wants to downplay this because he knows that a healing like this would be physically impossible by natural means in that sense. And so he calls him out. That was Joris Karl Huysmans, and he says this in his book, Foule de Lourdes. where he calls Zola out, an ally of Zola, by the way. So I think this case is particularly compelling because it involves a disease which at that time was incurable, that has a condition that is very visibly obvious. And even if we want to talk about diagnostic criteria from the 1800s, surely anyone with working eyes can see gaping ulcers and wounds on a person's face from tuberculosis, even if the exact cause could be disputed. That's not going to be something you could just misdiagnose. And same with it healing instantaneously. Sure, if this had happened over time, over the course of many months, we know cuts can heal over time, but cuts we know can't heal, especially deep wounds, within just a few minutes. And this is why Zola was trying to contest so much of the speed of this healing. But all the witnesses we have, including the medical ones there, including her own physicians, confirm this happened virtually instantaneously. And so I don't think that there's any plausible natural explanation you can come up with other than everyone is just fabricating this and lying, which I don't seem to be very plausible. So the fact that we have that, the fact that we have enemy attestation, that Emile Zola himself, who was a rationalist and still was after the event, didn't deny that the cure happened, I think it was all very powerful evidence. And for me, makes this one of Lourdes' most compelling miracles.
Yeah, what made it compelling for me, it's almost, the atheist quip that like, why doesn't God heal amputees? I feel like this is very, very close. It's not it's not a limb that grew back, but it's like a literal facial tissue that came back. One other detail that struck me, isn't it also the case that she had ulcerations on her leg?
Yes, and that's also partially why she couldn't walk either, and those went away at the same time.
All right, let's move to our second case.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. So just as we talked about a case from the 19th century in the first one, I think it'd be good to talk about one from the middle of the 20th century for the second one. Also of a woman named Marie. It's a common name for Catholic women back in the day, but Marie Bigot this time. So this happened in the 1950s. Marie at the time was 28, and in the hospital in St. Malo, she was diagnosed with having significant vision impairment. She had blurry eyes, and at the time her vision was about 3 out of 10, so 30%, which obviously is very impaired. By about a month after that, on April 3rd, Marie fell into a comatose state for a short period of time, and her temperature fluctuated all the way up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty significant. After she got out of that comatose state, though, her symptoms only grew worse from there. On April 18th, the medical records that we have talk about her further deteriorating. She had right side stiffness, she had bulging eyes, she had numbness within her right eye and the cornea, and she had hearing loss in the right ear. So it was clear that she had neurological symptoms on the right side of her body. On the 29th of April, surgeons decided to perform an explanatory surgery to find out what the issue was. They performed a trepidation, which is where they get a drill and drill a hole into the side of your head, into the skull, so that they can see the brain that way. And so when they looked at that, they noticed there was significant inflammation of the arachnoids, which surrounds the membranes of your brain. And they diagnosed it with posterior fossa arachnoiditis, basically indicating that there was swelling of the membranes that surround the neurons of the brain. So this was causing significant neurological effects like blindness and stiffness and all that stuff. So they released the adhesions, which means they cut it and were able to make that go away. But at that point, the damage had already been done. You can't reverse it once the deterioration to the brain cells have been there. So by July, this is about 3 or 4 months after that, her symptoms only grow worse from here. She has significant hemiplegia, which is paralysis on the side, on her right arm and her right leg. And her eyesight gets worse this time. She also remains deaf in the ear. Then by the time we get to December, so the end of 1951 now, another neurologist looks at her and confirms that the initial diagnosis was accurate, that this was inflammation within her brain that was causing this. Then we go all the way to August of 1952. So we've bolted about 8 months now as the next records we have. And at this point, when she goes back to the doctor, she is in significantly even worse condition, if you could imagine it, where she's essentially totally disabled. Her blindness now is almost total. It's about 1 out of 100, so 1% normal vision. So essentially she can just see light, and that's about it. Can't make out any shapes, any faces, anything like that. She's a total loss of smell. She has swallowing difficulties. She's almost completely paralyzed on her right side. And has impaired respiration. So at this point, her family would actually have to keep track of her by putting a rope around her waist, almost like a leash, but not on the neck. And they would pull her if she got, wandered off too far. So this is how they could have kept track of her. And she couldn't see or hear virtually at all at this point. So communication was they would have to take her left hand because the right was paralyzed, and they would have to write in the palm of the hand, 1 letter at a time. And that's how they would have to spell it out to her and to communicate. So you can imagine how sad and essentially pathetic that condition was. And there was one instance actually where she was wandering outside of her house. I guess she wasn't being supervised, I'm not sure. And as she's walking into the road, a car almost hits her. And so the person stops and is honking at her. She has no idea what's even going on. So her family runs and eventually gets her and moves her. But it completely even misses a car coming forward in the road. So that gives you an idea of how disabled this person was. So in August of 1952, after that examination that has her completely disabled, she's basically put into hospice care near death, where she's expected not to live for much longer. But 2 months after that, on October of 1952, she's brought to Lourdes on a stretcher, and there's no improvement at all in that sense. So the year after that, in October of 1953, they try again. Her family brings her on a stretcher to Lourdes. And as she's laying on this stretcher, someone who's making a documentary film comes, and there's a few frames of that. And you can see her in that film on the screenshots of it, of her lying there with her glasses on as an invalid, blind in that stretcher in a really sad state. But during this trip to Lourdes, she does regain sensation on the side of her body, the right side of her body, during the procession of the Eucharist. In that sense. So she gets up and is able to walk relatively unaided, although she still can't see, but her deafness and her blindness are still persistent. So she's regained some use in her leg and her arm, and so she's remarked by this. So they go and they're examined by the head Lourdes doctor at the time, which was Francois Lourdes. And he does confirm that her improvement has gotten better, that she no longer needs the orthopedic shoes and that she can walk normally. But he says, look, I can't file this in the medical bureau because she's clearly significantly disabled. She's still completely blind. She's still completely deaf. And if the Virgin Mary were to heal her, she wouldn't have done it halfway. So the next year, in 1954, Dr. Leroux at that point has passed away, and there is now a new head president of the Lourdes Medical Bureau, Joseph Pellissier. And so Marie Bigot's family thinks, well, since there's a new Lourdes doctor, maybe we can try again to get her cure certified. Maybe he'll have a different opinion. So in October 6 of 1954, they go back to Lourdes for the third time. She's examined by Dr. Pellissier, and he confirms that, no, she hasn't improved, that yes, she can walk, but her blindness is still completely there and her deafness is still completely there. So only 2 days after she was physically examined, so this is very close up in terms of the pre and post here, 2 days after that, on October 8th, during another procession of the Eucharist, she suddenly regains her hearing back, and she hears the pilgrims of Lourdes singing Ave Maria. And at that point, she can feel the rosary beads in her hands as well. So she notices, and she is teared up and is happy that she can now finally hear for the first time in about 2 years. But what about her sight, right? Well, on the way back from Lourdes on that train ride, this is now the early hours of October 11th. She's on the train with her doctor, and she starts to feel a tearing in her head that's initially very painful, but her eyesight basically starts off with like a light that gets brighter and brighter until it forms shapes, and then those shapes become blurs, and those blurs become more clear, and then she can see crystal clear within the matter of a few minutes. And so she's like, oh my gosh, I think I can see. And so her doctor, being there, sort of does an improv test where he pulls out a little prayer book, and he has her read the font, very small font on the bottom of it, and she has no issue reading it. And this is a pretty dimly lit train, mind you. This is early in the morning, like probably 2 a.m. in the morning or so. And he's very impressed. And so when she gets back home, she's then examined by an ear, nose, and throat doctor, where her hearing is now back, and she's examined with an ophthalmological exam that shows that she now has 10 out of 10 perfect vision, normal vision, which is remarkable considering that she had virtually total blindness and deafness only a few days before that. So her case is then reviewed from 1954 to 1956 by a panel of over 30 different physicians, including some well-respected neurologists and professors of medical schools at that time. And so her case is taken up by Dr. François Thibault, who then publishes a medical dossier that's presented to the Lourdes Medical Bureau. And this is where they go over it. And so finally, in 1956, 2 years after she was healed, Marie Bigot is declared the 59th official miracle of Lourdes. And she would go on to live a completely normal life without any relapse up until her death in 2016, which is remarkable. She was, I think, the age of about 93 years old, without any other issues until she died of natural causes, but her blindness and deafness never came back. So this is a pretty remarkable case. I think for the extent of disability, this was not someone who just had, slightly impaired vision where they need glasses. This is someone who's, by every definition, virtually completely blind, virtually completely deaf, severe neurological impairments, clearly can't take care of themselves. And within a few steps of a process, you have these things come back almost instantly, and they all happen at Lourdes. And I don't think that you can say this was something that was psychosomatic, because there was clear diagnostic indication of the swelling of the membranes and the anacriditis of that. And I think you can also say this wasn't brought about by suggestion or by the placebo effect, right? Because first of all, the placebo effect cannot bring about that drastic of a change in a severe neurological condition. It can bring about, what might look like temporary improvement, but it's not going to get you going from near total blindness to perfect vision. And in that sense, that's just not how dramatic those things work. And also the fact that it took 3 tries, I think, shows that it wasn't purely expectation, right? People's faith usually gets more hampered every time they do it and it doesn't work. So if she was cured purely by expectation, why wasn't she cured the first time? And why wasn't her strong desire to be cured the second time, even when she was insistent that she'd been cured and the doctor's like, no, you've only been partially cured? Why did that not go the full way either until the third time? So I think for all those reasons, there is not a plausible explanation. This particular disease, including most severe neurological diseases, don't usually just go into spontaneous remission permanently. Even today, this condition is very hard to cure, and there's no permanent cures for it. There's only medications that can mitigate the symptoms. But for something like this to completely go away as fast as it did without any treatments, whether modern or 20th century, is unheard of in the literature so far as I'm aware.
Yeah, one thing that I think is also important to point out is the context in which these miracles occur and in which these healings happen, right? Because you can say, oh, well, neurological deficiencies can heal over time. There is in the literature, and I've actually got some personal experience with this. I had a family member who had a neurological condition, and the doctors were like, yeah, maybe he'll come out of it. Maybe he'll get a little bit better over time, but not instantaneously. He's not going to wake up one morning and just be back, right? So it can happen over time. But I think the important part is the context. Like they go to this church, they're experiencing Eucharistic adoration or the Eucharistic procession, and then that's when these things happen. The sort of coincidental nature of these healings is what is really important to focus on. It's not that these are happening, just randomly, like in the middle of the night when she's somewhere else. It's happening when she's at Lourdes. Something is going on, and then she starts to feel better coincidentally at the same place and same time when other things are happening religiously. So I think that's important to continue to emphasize.
Yeah. And people will often say correlation isn't causation, but you also can't establish causation without correlation. So it's true that not in every case you can say that the correlation automatically means that that's what caused it. But given the religious context, given that there's no plausible natural mechanism by which this could have happened, I don't see any reason to think that the theistic explanation that God performed a miracle in this case is implausible outside of, broader humane objections.
All right, Caleb, we are now ready for case number 3.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. So this is one of the most recent cases at Lourdes in this sense. So this happened in 2008, so 21st century now, with modern diagnostic criteria and modern methods. So the story begins, though, about 40 years prior to that, 1965. We have Bernadette Murillo. Now, Bernadette Murillo was actually named after Bernadette Subaru, who, if you remember, is the young girl who claimed to see the Virgin Mary in Lourdes. So her family had a lot of adoration for Saint Bernadette, and so they named her after that. So Bernadette Murillo became a nun fairly early in her life, but this was complicated by progressively worsening signs of a disease. So in 1965, she had left side lumbosacral pains in her back mostly and towards her hip. And this was caused by a narrowing in her spinal canal, which was very unpleasant. In 1968, she undergoes the first of what is 4 different surgeries. There's no improvement. In the 1970s, she has a second and a third surgery that tries to treat inflammation of the nerve roots in her spine and lower back. But this doesn't work, and she actually has worse chronic pain and has to get regular painkillers. So she has her fourth surgery in 1975, which is and at this point, they have to insert an intracanal nerve stimulator into her body. So it's implanted into her spinal column, and her symptoms still persist after this as well. So at this point, she has to stop being a nurse, which she did as a sister, and basically had to retire from that since due to her disability. But over the course of the next few years, her condition would only get worse, as is common with this. So she was diagnosed with cauda equina, which is basically a neurological condition of the lower back and upper hip that can cause severe disability, especially within the legs and basically unmanageable pain, especially for this time when modern pain management methods were not available. They were basically using morphine, which was not as effective. But even with all of these treatments and all of these morphine injections and the spinal injections, none of this did hardly anything to fix it, including the 4 surgeries. By 1987, she has chronic sciatic pain that goes down to her legs. So now it is spread down to her legs from her back. And she has to use a cervical lumbar corset. So she has to tie this corset to her back, basically, to keep it straight and to manage it, because without it, the pain becomes almost unbearable. In 1988, she's officially designated as an invalid and someone who largely is unable to move their legs comfortably in that sense. In the 90s, she has a little bit of an improvement in her symptoms, but then quickly relapses by 1994. And now she's on daily morphine intake. So every day she is taking copious amounts of painkillers to manage it. And she now has a foot drop. So her foot is in a cast and it's bent. She's usually wheelchair dependent. She can only walk small distances without it or without canes. Unmanageable back pain, daily doses of painkillers. So you can imagine quite a miserable sentence, but it only gets worse. In 1995, she then loses more feeling in her lower body, and she has bladder incontinence and urinary incontinence, and her bowel loses control. So she now has a catheter, right? She can't use the bathroom on her own anymore. She can't feel that sensation. By 2002, she gets even worse condition, and now she has quasi-paraplegia, which means she mostly can't use her legs at this point. And she's largely wheelchair dependent and has a leg splint. And she has functional electrostimulation device in her limbs in order to help her move them, but she can't move them on her own. It has to stimulate the nerves, basically. In 2005, she has additional spinal infiltrations, additional spinal things added on, doesn't help. In 2007, she then becomes incontinent in her bile. So both her bowels and her bladder now she has lost control of. So I paint this whole picture, as gross and sad as it is, just to show that this is a very long history, medical history, of 40 years of a condition that is growing worse over time, that is neurological, that is clearly not manageable by treatments, that the treatments are not doing anything to improve her condition. She's only getting worse with age. She's now, I believe, in her 60s and is clearly in worse health and is considered essentially, fully disabled. So seeing that there was no other option, in July of 2008, her physician thinks it'd be good for her mental health if she goes to Lourdes as a nun to help give her that solace. So she goes to Lourdes in July, and nothing actually remarkable happens while she's at Lourdes. She has a good time, but no physical signs change. She's wheeled around in her wheelchair. But actually, when she gets back a few days later, she feels physically worse, and that's mostly from jet lag, as you can imagine, traveling in that condition. So on July 11th, this was 3 days after she got back from Lourdes, she is sitting in her chapel where she feels compelled to pray. And so she goes into the sanctuary and prays. And as she's doing this, she hears what she described as an internal voice telling her to take off the boot that she had and take off the corset that she was in. And so she gets out of the wheelchair, she goes up to her room and she takes off the boot, she takes off the corset, and she realizes now that her foot, which was crooked, is now straightened again, right? And she realizes that she has feeling in her legs and can walk around, and that she has no pain now. And she gets remarkable about this. So she stops the morphine from that day on. She suddenly doesn't have any issues with incontinence. So she removes her catheter, all that stuff. And then the day after that, on July 12th, she walks 3 miles with her sister-in-law. Take in mind, this is someone who hasn't walked autonomously, at least without assistance or without stimulations, in many years. And yet, despite the muscle atrophy, she has no issue walking many miles with her sister to do this. So the next year, she goes back to Lourdes and tells the medical president there, Alessandro De Francisi, that she'd been healed the previous year in 2008. And so they decide to open up an investigation. And this investigation is extremely copious. She is seen by multiple psychiatrists in Paris to make sure that there was nothing psychosomatic or delusional going on. She is sent to rheumatologists. She is sent to many neurologists. There are 2 times where they have to redo scans of imagery and review this. So after all of this process, in 2018, so 10 years after this, she had not relapsed. She had not gotten any resolution. She had not had the symptoms come back. They finally declared that this was a medically inexplicable cure, and Sister Bernadette Murillo was declared miracle number 70. so the third most recent one of the Lourdes catalog. And in 2020, the ABC News show 2020 would come and would interview Sister Bernardo and the other Lourdes physicians there. And it's pretty remarkable because Alessandro De Franciscis, the Lourdes medical president there, is insistent that not only is this process peer-reviewed, but that Sister Bernadette was, and this is in his exact words, seen by at least, with virtual certainty, he says that she was seen by at least 300 physicians, and that if anyone is interested in looking into her record, they can come to southern France at Lourdes, and he'd be more than happy to show them the file. And then he proceeds to pull out the file and show the reporter all of the scans and all the documentation. So that is pretty remarkable that someone with a worsening neurological condition of over 40 years that clearly was immune to treatments, at least any effective treatments, surgeries, continually deterioration in health, suddenly and instantaneously after going to a religious pilgrimage while in a chapel, while praying like that, recovers all function again of symptoms for the first time in 40 years. And that hundreds, literally hundreds of doctors and specialists who peer-reviewed this had no medical explanation to this. Now, we can always posit some kind of strange remission, some kind of anomaly, but with that degree of peer review, this is looked at by far more than most case reports would in normal medical practice. So whatever we think of this, it certainly was highly scrutinized and seems very difficult to do. And of course, this is a modern account, right? Even if one is cynical of older accounts from the 1800s or 1900s, this is one that only happened less than 20 years ago or so, only a little over 10 years ago. So it's pretty remarkable in that sense. And cauda equina is not a disease that normally goes away. It's if you get immediate treatment or surgery within a few days of diagnosis, you might have a decent prognosis. But without that and without modern surgery, certainly back in the 60s, they didn't have means of treating it effectively. The prognosis was going to be total paralysis, and there was no positive expectation that she would get any better, as her medical history shows. So all of those reasons, I think, make this one of the most compelling cases in the catalog of Lourdes.
Yeah. So you mentioned the catalog of Lourdes. I mean, we've only gone through 3 cases, right? And there are, at least from my research, at least 7,000 reports of healings, and only 72 so far that have been confirmed by the Lourdes Medical Bureau. Now, that is remarkable that there are 72 confirmed through the Medical Bureau that have occurred, right? That's remarkable. Nevertheless, there are millions and millions of people that visit Lourdes every year. I think the estimates are around 4 to 6 million pilgrims to Lourdes every year. So then one objection would be, why don't we see more miracles, right? Shouldn't there be, like, why does, if Mary's intercession is real, if this is like a real place that people go and they receive healing sometimes, why doesn't it happen more often? Shouldn't this be happening more and more and more than it does?
Yeah, and that's a great question. That is a common objection. I would say that I don't think that under theism we can predict the frequency of miracles. I think you can say God would plausibly do miracles, but how often, how rarely, it's hard to know. But it's also a bit of a red herring, right? To say, it's like, suppose that one amputee actually did grow a leg back at Lourdes, right? Would it be reasonable to say, but why don't more grow back, right? Look at all the ones that haven't. So we could just say that that's due to chance. Well, no, that would be an argument that most people wouldn't take seriously, because there are some things where chance alone is not going to account for the mechanisms that come into play here. So although it may be the case that there are relatively rare ones at Lourdes, that doesn't mean that the ones that we do have are irreparable. In fact, if anything, I think it makes them stronger, because it shows that they've gone through a very delicate peer review process that is not just taken, it's not credulously just accepted where every report is just taken as a miracle. There's a very strict criteria that it has to be a cure that is organic, progressively worsening, medically documented, that it's a cure that is instantaneous, that's complete, that's permanent, and that doesn't happen with any relevant medical treatment. And with those criteria, I think we do a good job of stifling out ones like that. So just as I think it would also be a red herring for someone, say, who is skeptical of evolution, if you were to show them some transitory fossils, say, but why don't we have this particular transition fossil? Or why don't we have this one? Why do we only have these few dozen and not like millions of them, right? It's sort of missing the point to say, we can't talk about the evidence that we don't have. We have to talk about the evidence that we do have. And the evidence we do have is, I think, very compelling no matter how you square it.
Yeah. So what would we say, or what would a naturalist or an atheist be able to say in response to these cases? Because again, we've only covered 3. There's at least 72 that are confirmed, that have been past the medical board. What can a naturalist really respond with? Like what explanatory options are left or are open to them?
Yeah, I think that the only plausible one that I could think of would be some kind of just concession that there are medical anomalies, and that it is true that there's lots of things in medicine we don't understand, and that we can't essentially square and guard the gaps, right? But I don't think that that's as much of an objection, because although yes, we don't want to just assume that God is automatically the reason. We also have to look at the fact that these are not just anomalies, but that they're specifically defined, that they happen within a religious context, right? The fact that cauda equina doesn't normally go away in this kind of manner under these conditions, in literally any documented case that I've been able to find, or that any of the doctors who looked in this have been able to find, is remarkable, right? Like if this was some kind of rare anomaly, surely we'd have at least some secular examples of it. At least that's what you would predict under naturalism, right? But under theism, you'd predict that we wouldn't expect to really find any parallels, because God would uniquely be setting that religious context. And so that would make them stand out from what would otherwise be normal. So I think the uniqueness of the religious context and the fact that it's very difficult to replicate outside of that works. Why is it that Lourdes is privileged to these unknown natural laws? It's not the water. We've done tests on the water. There's nothing special about the Lourdes grotto that causes these. So I think that is itself very significant to that extent.
Yeah. So what about the Humean objection that, the testimony is always going to be more unreliable than the fact that a miracle occurred? The miracle is always going to be less likely, in other words.
Yeah, I would say that that's problematic for 2 reasons. One is that Humeanism, I think, at least as Hume formulated it, was based just on frequentism, a probability. So he's essentially saying that you count the number of times people aren't healed and have to contrast the amount of times people are allegedly healed, and you're never going to get the second one out doing the first one, right? But we don't normally do probability like that, at least not in the modern day. It's not based on frequency, because every event, if you define it specifically enough, is unique, right? It's based on categories and prior probabilities as well. And Hume didn't have as much of an understanding of that. As far as testimony goes as well, we have to be careful, because testimony is including scientific terms, right? Whenever a scientist observes something in a laboratory and puts it in a study, that is testimonial evidence. It's good testimonial evidence because it's under controlled conditions and from a reputable source. And so that's what we have to say. We're not just talking about people who heard a story from someone and it's anecdotal, right? We have people who observe these, often with medical tests and x-rays in controlled conditions and laboratory settings, where this person was seen by doctors for decades, in some cases, repeatedly. And this was repeated that they were sick and they're cured, and the Lourdes doctors repeat that, and they do 1,000 tests to make sure that person stays cured. We can repeat these conditions before and after, and we can verify these with controlled conditions. And so, yes, it is going off of the testimony of doctors, but that's the same kind of testimony that you could use in any court of law with medical records, or any science lab if it was under proper conditions. So if we were to throw out that kind of testimony that's by scientists under controlled conditions, that's repeatable, we'd be getting rid of a lot of stuff in science that I don't think we'd want to concede.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just clearly question begging. There was a book, Hume, Holism and Miracles. I think that's the name of it. Mm-hmm. It just points out that his whole enterprise is questioning. I mean, not to mention the guy was a blatant racist. So we can just use the ad hominem argument there and just discount everything he says. I'm just kidding, but no, his argument against miracles, it really is just once you get down to it, it really is just begging the question. You've got to look at the actual evidence that we have, and you can't just dismiss it just because you don't like miracles. You have to take it seriously and try to come up with some explanation. Yeah,
and I would like to press anyone who's skeptical of this, and it's good to be skeptical, but I think keeping open mind is good. So, if Alex O'Connor is watching, or Paul Logie, or anyone else, any other skeptic, like, we're looking at these cases, and I think pressing on what is the explanation. I don't think that saying I don't know, but it's not God is going to be good enough. I think you have to show issues with the theistic hypothesis to criticize it. You can't just say we can't incorporate theism and we say we don't know, right? If theism is a good explanation and has better explanatory power than the alternatives, which I would think it does in this case, we have no reason to reject it unless you have other reasons for thinking theism is implausible. So I would want to ask those people, like, yeah, if you look into this and do you accept that this event actually happened as relayed? And if not, why not? And then 2, if you do accept that the event itself happened, the person really did get cured of this disease in this way, then what would you propose is the most probable explanation? And why would you think that? So,
right. Like, just go back to Marie. How do we pronounce her last name?
Le Marchand. You're doing the French.
Le Marchand.
Yeah.
How do we explain her face being completely missing, like the cartilage is eaten away, her teeth are showing? How do we explain that just like instantaneously it's back, like grown back, on her face? It doesn't happen.
And we shouldn't posit, when people talk about unknown natural laws, right? Normally we don't want to posit unknown natural laws if they contradict other stuff we know, right? Like if you have a gap in a scientific theory and you make models, that's one thing. But the problem is with Marie's case, for example, we know very well how fast cells reproduce, how much skin cells grow. There's a whole, and the entire field of dermatology could tell you that, like how long does it take skin cells to grow, cut back, and all that stuff like that. So if you want to posit there's some unknown natural law out there that causes cells to replicate at within a few minutes to fill up gaps like that, you'd have to rewrite
without surgery, right? Without plastic surgery,
yes,
without
exactly. And without plastic surgery, you wouldn't even get that good of a repair, right? But even then, to have it to happen that quickly, you're literally rewriting the laws of biology and cell theory at that point. And it would just be a terrible theory that you couldn't test, right? It's the same reason why the philosopher Robert Lummer gave this example, where he says, if you came home and you found that you have a diamond in a valuable safe, and you come home and you find that the diamond is gone, right? And you don't have any initial evidence of burglary. You could say, well, look, I haven't seen the burglar. Historically, we haven't had burglars break into houses in this neighborhood, so a burglar might not be likely. We can say frequency. It's not common that burglars come into this neighborhood, right? And so you say, instead, I think that the diamond disintegrated. I think there's some unknown natural law that the diamond just evaporated within my safe. That'd be a much worse theory. And even though that maybe we haven't seen the burglar is a much better theory, because we know that burglars in principle might be interested in stealing diamonds, right? Whereas the evaporation diamond theory is a terrible theory, because we have so much evidence that diamonds don't do that, and the mechanics we'd have to rewrite physics at that point, because the mechanics wouldn't make any sense. So in the same way, I think you'd have to rewrite biology to say that skin cells and muscles and all that stuff can grow back within a few minutes. At that point, you're just having to posit a completely ad hoc theory that there's no evidence for.
Yeah, and I just want to remind the audience that these are we've only covered 3 cases. At Lourdes alone, there are at least 72 that have been, again, confirmed by the medical bureau. But this is, again, just a drop in the bucket for the total number of miracles that we have in favor of Christianity. You're writing a book on this, Caleb. Can you just give us some examples of some other miracles that you've investigated, looked into, that are included in your book, just for people to maybe look into?
Yeah, at Lourdes, or just in general?
Just in general.
Yeah, I think there's lots of ones you can do. And again, when you find other cases comparable to this in a religious context, I think it raises the likelihood of that, right? You have, for example, there was one in the 1920s of a baby named Peter Smith who was just born. And normally they would apply nitrate to the eyes to clear them out. But the nurse on staff did the wrong dosage. And instead of doing 1% nitrate, which is normal, she did 50% nitrate, which is enough to burn tumors off of skin. And so 3 doctors confirmed that the corneas were completely burnt off the baby's eyes, but they go and they pray for the intercession of Sister Cabrini, who had recently passed away at that point. And overnight, the baby's eyes were completely normal again. The cornea scarring was gone. It had scars under the eyelids, but the actual eyesight and stuff was fine. The membranes had essentially come back. And Peter Smith would grow up with completely normal eyesight. So that was one that was used as an intercession miracle for Sister Cabrini in that sense. You also have cases of people who were paralyzed for sometimes decades with nerve damage, including ones from chordotomies where they had surgeries that severed nerve endings, and they were able to walk again in that sense. There was a recent one of one that I was still looking into, but I managed to include it in the book, of someone, I think his name is James Drain, and he had been blinded from multiple sclerosis. It was a combination of multiple sclerosis and chemical exposure since I think about 2015. And he was legally blind and severely impaired. And this one's actually on video, but as he goes and gets baptized in 2023, when he comes out of the water, his eyesight is normal again. And he goes and gets this tested at an ophthalmology center, and his eyesight's now 20/25, which is better than what it was even before he went blind with the MS. And there's a whole documentary on that one coming out. So that one's cool because it's also on video. But you have dozens and dozens of cases like this with medical documentation. And I've really tried my hardest to do that. There have been people like Craig Keener who've had great books on this. And I've definitely been inspired by Keener, but I wanted to take it a step further and really focus on medical documentation and going to the lengths of citing the sources and citing all the doctors, where sometimes almost to a point where it's a bit tedious, but sometimes the details matter in these cases like that. So many cases like that of neurological conditions, of things growing back, of clubbed feet, babies born with clubbed feet that straighten on their own, wounds closing on their own, as we had seen, deafness, tumors, etc. All these things that don't go away naturally, or at least don't go away as fast as they do in these cases. So all of that combined, I think, makes a very strong evidentiary case for miracles. And if the skeptic says, like, where's this evidence? I would say, look, Lourdes has 72 recognized miracles. Why don't we start there and then go from there? And we can go to the canonization miracles, which you've talked about before, or any of the other ones. But let's start with just the list of the 72 Lourdes miracles and see if we can go from there, if you want a place to start for looking at miracle claims.
All right, Caleb, this has been awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Cameron.
Look, I know this has been a lot to take in: diagnoses, surgeries, medical boards, timelines stretching across decades, but that's kind of the point. We haven't been looking at vague anecdotes or inspirational stories your grandma forwards on Facebook. We've been looking at 3 rigorously documented cases, each with specialist medical records and long-term follow-up. 3 cases from different centuries involving different diseases, all converging on the same pattern: sudden, complete, medically inexplicable healings in a religious context. And here's the question everyone has to answer, okay? On which worldview does this kind of thing make sense? If you're a naturalist, you have to say that each case, every single one, including the ones that we haven't covered on the show, isn't what it looks like. Marie Lemonchar's facial tissue didn't instantly regenerate. Everyone just sort of missaw it or something. Marie Bigot didn't go from near total paralysis, blindness, and deafness to normal functioning. Decades of doctors somehow missed something. Sister Bernadette didn't recover from 40 years of progressive neurological collapse overnight. Hundreds of physicians reviewing her file just sort of overlooked the real explanation. Is that possible? I mean, technically, yes, like everything is sort of possible in the abstract, but is it remotely plausible that every line of testimony, every scan, every surgical record, every specialist involved is part of a century-spanning pattern of error that just so happens to point in a single direction? That's asking quite a bit. On Christianity, especially Catholic Christianity, this is exactly the kind of world that you'd expect. Most alleged miracles turn out to be nothing too crazy, but a few survive the hardest scrutiny and point beyond what nature can do on its own. Not as a magic trick, not as a proof that forces belief and overrides free will, but as a signpost. So Alex, and anyone watching, here is the invitation. Don't wave this away. Okay, don't default to there must be some natural explanation when every natural explanation has already been examined and ruled out. Ask the live question: what is the best explanation of the world that we actually live in? Because once you follow the evidence, Christianity isn't just more plausible than teenage Alex thought. It starts looking true.